Greetings, my name is Stephanie Bratnax, and I will be doing a presentation on autism spectrum disorder and ambient air pollution in Taiwan. The purpose of this study, or you should say the objective, is to examine the relationship between ambient air pollution and autism spectrum disorder, also known as ASD. This is a prospective cohort study. It is population-based, meaning that this study appeals to those who have some sort of relation to ASD. Another reason or purpose of this study is to determine other possible factors influencing the onset of ASD. So in this case, we're going to be studying ambient air pollution and things alike. So a cohort study is when an outcome or a disease-free study populations is first identified by the exposure or event of interest and followed in full time until disease or outcome of interest occurs. So this means that you have two groups. You have the group that's non-exposed, and I believe you have the group that is exposed, and then you follow them over a long period of time, and you determine which group develops the disease or who were affected by the exposure. And the cohort study, although it is a great way to follow people, there are two ways that you can conduct a study, and it's a retrospective and prospective. In this case, it is a prospective cohort study, which means that it's concerned with the future and what data has to say, in the future. So now the objective of this study is to determine whether long exposure to ambient air pollution is related to ASD diagnoses. According to the researchers, the studies are limited, but this study was aimed to confirm that there may be a close association. There was no hypotheses specified, but it also talks about the association between postnatal exposure, prenatal exposure, ambient air pollution, and ASD in Taiwan. What is ASD? Autism spectrum disorder is a really prevalent issue that's not really talked about. And for somebody who's in the field of ABA and who works closely and personally with children with autism, I can say that this field has boomed tremendously, with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention stating that 1 in 59 children are affected by this condition in 2014, actually not 2012, compared to 1 in 88 in 2008. That is a very, very, very crazy increase, given that this condition is not, I wouldn't say it's uncommon, but it's starting to become more common, especially in boys. But other than that, this condition is a prevalent neurological disorder that not only impairs social, verbal, and nonverbal communication, but also affects development in language, motor skills, and it also causes some sort of sensory formulations or some sort of automatic reinforcement, things within that nature. So we are discussing ambient air pollution because that is the exposure in the study. They're trying to determine whether metal exposure or gas exposure causes some sort of reaction in the body that for some reason you start developing autism. Like I said, research is limited, but in this study alone, the metals, I believe it's mercury, that was studied in this cohort, but other gases like carbon monoxide, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide, those were studied or examined in the study to determine whether there was a correlation. What this means is that it produces a lot of questions and it produces a lot of public health issues and implications, referring more towards the environment and how that affects the health of people. It's just really public health related, and it's really, really good to think about these things, and you have to be mindful about it. This dangerous environmental exposure is linked to inadequate public health, causing air to be poisonous with exposures. And according to researchers, as I stated before, research is limited on this topic, but we can have full confidence that this cohort study actually does a great job in proving that there is some sort of association. So population demographics. With ASD, the onset usually happens once you hit probably about 2 to 3 years old. And in this study, 1 million children were considered at baseline. So a lot of kids enrolled in this study, but of course, based on like inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, not everybody was admitted or were seen as a participant in the study. So out of all those kids, out of 1 million children, only 49,073 children were confirmed chosen to participate in this population-based prospective cohort. Now, in order for them to also participate, they must be ages 3 or less during the baseline year of 2000. And it's at 2000 because this cohort study was followed for a 10-year period. So from 2000 to 2010, that's when the cohort took place. So baseline was 2000. So in order for you to be participating in the study, you ought to be 3 years or less during the baseline. Description of the study sample. Now, the recruitment strategy was, as I stated before in the last slide, it was just a simple enrollment. Basically, hey, if you want to be in the study, go for it. If you want to determine whether pollution causes autism, go for it. So there wasn't really no specifications of how these people were enrolled, but use your imagination. Now, as I stated before, the sample size was 49,073 children aged less than 3 at the start. I'm sorry, ages 3 or less at the start of the study. Now, prior to this chosen, it was 1 million kids were considered. However, there was some inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria that actually affected the sample size calculation. And for example, inclusion criteria was children needing to be age 3 or less. You cannot be diagnosed with autism at the baseline, obviously, and that's just mainly for the inclusion criteria. Now, exclusion, I feel like it's more towards those like at the end of the study and more like validation purposes. So, like for example, when participants were evaluated after that long period of time, they must have had 2 consensus diagnoses of ASD. Asperger's syndrome, which is actually a part of ASD. I mean, remember, ASD is actually a really big spectrum. So there's like pervasive developmental disorder, you have Asperger's disorder, you have autistic disorder, a lot of comorbidities like exist within that as well, such as like anxiety, depression, OCD, ADHD, ADD, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there was no randomization given that it was a cohort study, and if we think that there should be a randomization, then we're probably violating some sort of ethical code, because it is inappropriate to use a randomization method, especially when you're studying diseases and exposure. So those are things to be mindful of. There were no control groups, but exposure and exposed group. Like I said, it was a cohort study, and I believe that the cohort study was a perfect fit for this because those type of studies are designed to study diseases that are new or possibly rare, or if you want to like see like the growth or like the onset of it and what affects, that disease and what stimuli like affects it, etc. So, and it goes back to saying like maybe having a control group may cause ethical dilemmas as well. We can't control those, meaning we can't force people to be exposed to air pollution, for example, because that would be unethical. So we have to be mindful of that. Now, statistical analysis or statistical analyses, actually, there were several methods used. For example, the exposure assessment was the inverse distance weighting, and it actually these models were conducted on the gas and metal exposure, but it was used to form some sort of exposure parameter. So I guess they wanted to have some sort of like threshold to say, hey, okay, once it hits this level, then you're at a higher risk of exposure to ASD. Or if you're at this low, it's okay. Like, for example, the FDA does approve like chemicals in the food as long as it's a very low dose, and that won't really affect us as much. So that's possibly why they decided to conduct this inverse distance weighting to determine some sort of parameter, to determine like some sort of threshold, like what can we base this on. Now, the two tests that were used were the extended Cox proportional hazards, and that model was used to explore the temporal relationship between the exposed group and the exposure. So this determined the relationship between time and exposure and the people who are being exposed. So what does time have to do with it? Is being exposed to long periods of time increase the risk of developing ASD at a faster rate and at a more detrimental rate? Like, for example, having more developmental delays than compared to an ASD child that may be high functioning, or they may be verbal and things like that. So things to think about. Another thing too is chi-square test and t-test. And chi-square test was used to determine the strength of the association. Yeah, we know that there's an association, but how strong is it? Is it reliable? Is it valid? So they used a chi-square test to determine that conclusion. Now, results was multivariate. There were confounding variables. Statistics concluded that there is, in fact, an association. Although there is limited research, the study did indicate that there was. I did agree with the study, given that a lot of ASD onset symptoms actually come from the environment, which is why they say that children with autism should eat a very, very low sugar diet, a very low glycemic diet, things like that. So if you study further on ASD, you'll notice that although there are some genetic factors that cause ASD, I feel like, you know what, I wouldn't say I feel like, because this is science we're talking about. It states that there's a lot of environmental exposures that contribute to not the onset of ASD, but it contributes more to the condition, compared to somebody who tends to exercise, possibly eats a low glycemic diet or a low sugar diet or low carbohydrate diet, maybe perhaps like a ketogenic diet. I've read studies that actually determine that a ketogenic diet is actually good for ASD. So that just to show you that the environmental factors do play a significant role. Now, the results were multivariate because confounding variables were taken into consideration. Variables such as anxiety, bipolar disorder, depressive disorder, OCD, phobic disorder, and intellectual disability. Now, the researchers concluded that there is an association between the gases, metals, and the onset of ASD. And as I stated before, I do agree with this conclusion, not only because I have personal experience working in the field, but I do agree that being exposed to such poisonous toxins can be harmful for the body. It does have some sort of cancer effect. It's not good for the body, especially if we're being exposed to carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide has a reputation for killing people after they inhaled it for such a long time and for long periods of time. Although we're not inhaling it as much as people who probably might have passed away from it, we are inhaling small amounts that do build up over time. So another good thing that the study pointed out is that those who live right next to freeways, I believe it's about 350 meters away from a freeway, have a higher risk of developing ASD due to the fact that there's a lot of carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide, a lot of nitrogen and like sulfur. It's just a lot of poisonous toxins that you really don't want to put in your body, especially if you're experiencing some sort of developmental delay and your body is not really as strong. But the researchers should have included other confounding variables, which they did not. So that's actually a limitation of the study. So confounders such as genetic factors, parental demographics, prenatal exposure, pregnant women who are exposed to air pollution, and birth weight are all examples. So I would probably disagree with that, meaning that maybe the study was a little bit exaggerated. It can be a little unreasonable. It may result in bias. It's just a lot of things that we can conclude. Not every study is perfect, but these are actually confounding variables that actually do contribute to this condition. Like, for example, genetic factors, pregnant women who are exposed to this, or age, sex, or just genetics and things like that. So it's just a lot more to it that these people should have considered. And it may hinder or alter the study or the results of the study. Thank you.